Good morning, Hemshech Ayin Beis, Volume 3. We're on page 1338. And we're going to review the last section, which is the explanation that he began at the bottom of page 1333, was to explain how the Yud Gimel's Midas Harachmim were revealed to Moshe Rabbeinu. The process in which they were revealed teaches us their power. And what is that power? The power is that it's coming from Gevuros of Atik. So a very high level of intensity, power, and force, Gvura, in the context of Tagberis, Atzmis, as we learned, a core, powerful intensity that allows and carries the Hamshacha all the way down below, even to the darkest places, even to a place of sins. And it also has discretion and distinction. That's why it's called Midas Harachim, 13 midas from the word midah, but it's a medida atzmis. It's a core type of definition, meaning from the essence defining itself, not a definition based on the parameters of creation, but definition based on the divine lack of parameters. Is choosing to enter into the world of parameters. So like he said at the bottom of page 1337, that Nimshklamada comes a chalkus like cyrus. That's why it comes from the cyrus, which are the hairs, like the wires, the thin strands that carry from Malchus to Ma, which is with the Gevuros of Atik, Butzina D'Karidnusa, Malchus to Ma, and from there go the Yud Gimel Sarachmim, which have the power to transform Zdeinis to Zachis, deliberate sins to merits, as we discussed at length. So now, how was this revealed to Moshe? So it was revealed to Moshe as he was standing on a rock inside of a crevice, Nikra Sur, that God created, where he placed Moshe Rabbeinu there, and then he passed through with his glory, and that's when the Yud Gimel Midas Harachmim were revealed. So in the words of the Rebbe Rashab, he says, and that's the Sur. What does the Sur indicate? That Moshe Rabbeinu was within a type of, we'll call it, within a type of cavity, within an empty space, which we've learned is the Cholol, the Reshimu, or the level of Butzina D'Karidnusa, Gevuros Atik. That's a concealed state, like a tzur, where everything is concealed. You don't see the sparks that come out of the rock, out of a flintstone. They're all only in a potential form, but they're all there. And it's the Shedish Ha'avoyas. So he says that's referring to the tzur, is the rock, and the crevice within the rock is this vacuum or this cavity, which indicates this concealed space, referring to this high level where the Yud Gimel Midas Harachmim originate from. And Hashem, God showed him these 13 attributes by hiding him. Remember, it's a concealed state. In the crevice within the rock. Which is Sharsha Havayas Anal, as he explained on top of page 1334. Right. From Yeshaya, which is going on Sarah, the womb of Sarah. So the womb is now an example for this cavity. The womb is a concealed place, but it gives birth, but it is the place that gestates and develops the child. So the child that will be born will come from the womb. The womb here is an example for the Nikras HaTzur, but within the Tzur is a space, and that's where Moshe Rabbeinu stood. He's going to explain and put it in a simple asis of Chassidus, that is the bittul. By Moshe Rabbeinu being like in a state of bittul where he's in a concealed state, that creates a kilei reikon, like a womb, an empty space that draws down and allows you to access the highest levels of energy. So the interesting thing is, even though it's Gevuros Atik, Butzina D'Karidnusa, the Reshimu, like you explained and will explain, but yet it's in a concealed state. So on one hand, it's a tremendous power there, but it's all in a very potent state, like in a tzur, in a rock, and the power is there, but it's not revealed. So how do you access it? By standing within the womb. That's a type of bit, like he's going to touch his clay reikon, like an empty container that allows you to draw down the highest levels of energy. And that's where Moshe Rabbeinu had to be in order for this to be revealed. Now, the next section So now comes down. So what level is this in the spheres? What's the level? So you're going to say three things. Based on this, that is the rechem, is the womb of Sarah. That's Yesod Nukva. In Nukva, which is Malchus, there's the Yesod, that's the womb. In the Pardes, he's going to say that it's referring to the Tzur is Binah, Nikas Tzur is the Yesod of Ima. It's, so to speak, the womb within Binah, within the mother, not within Malchus. And here we're talking about Gevuros of Atik, which is Butzina D'Karidnusa. According to the Zera Rakia, it is interpreted as being, which is the Reshimu. So that's the level, like he says, Malchus the Ein Sof. You say Malchus of Ein Sof. So it's not Malchus of Atzilus, Malchus of Ein Sof, which has similarity to the first interpretation. But what about the second interpretation, that it's Yesod Ima? So he brings what we learned earlier, that Yesod Ima is the second Ibur Sheni. As the midas grow, so there's the Ibur Rishon would be Yesod Malchus, and the Ibur Sheni Yesod Ima, the level of B'chol Meidecha. And he claims what Yesod the Nukva is Bechinas Iskashrus. It means a level of connecting L'Kabla Liklis Hasheva, because he's in the form of a Klei Reik, and Bechinas Klei Reik on Machzik. Like we said, within a womb, Yesod creates. Yesod we know is Iskashrus connection, but how do you create a connection between two entities? If their egos are dominant, if their identity is dominant, they can't connect, so they connect by bittul. And that's the Yesod, the womb. Liklitis Hashefa, L'Kabla Liklitis Hashefa. If the womb and the mother, on even a physical level, would be full of identity, didn't have the space for the child could not develop. And the child too has to be concealed there for the child to grow. It can't be an entity of its own, as long as it's in pregnant stage. So there's the stage of Ibur Rishon. That's, as we discussed yesterday, that's the midas that are born from the Chacham and Binah, the midas apitam v'das, the rational midas that are born from a contemplation, where Chacham and Binah give birth to a midas, to love, to reverence, avayira. And then the midas, as they mature and grow, they elevate to a second stage of gestation and development in Yesod Ima, in Binah, like we learned earlier. And the final line, he says, so here, he's speaking about a bittul. Apparently, when you say nukvi, say the nukvi, he's talking on a lower level, that is the bittul, that the animal soul, in order to be a so this is referring on the highest level, it's referring to the Reshimu, and referring to the Butzina D'Karidnusa, the rock, and the crevice, or the cavity within the rock, which is what Moshe Rabbeinu was a keli to receive Gevuros of Atik. But if we learned earlier, B'chol Meidecha, remember, the Av is not just for the Nefesh L'Kis, it's also the animal soul should be transformed and be a keli. So apparently, I would say, after the Ibur Sheni, the animal soul also, or even before Ibur Sheni, either way you can say, it also has a bittul, it also wants to, that's when we're dealing with tshuva, because tshuva is already a soul that's someone that sinned. And now we need tshuva, Yud Gimel Midas Harachim. So how do you draw down Yud Gimel Samrachim to correct the sin? We also need sur. We also need this bittul. The nikra is the cavity within the sur. And that apparently is Yesod the Nukva, not Yesod the Malchus of Ein Sof, because there's no Nefesh Habamis, even though maybe the root, the Helam there may be the root of the lower Helam, but here it's a lower level. It's the Nefesh Habamis through Tshuva, as shall be explained. And then finally, in the parentheses, he says, I am Mashakosa be'inyan klei reikon, be'inyan klei reikon, about the idea of an empty container, like I'm speaking, a cavity, the space within the rock, to look in Teira Eir, in Mishpatim, the Maimer Le'ti Meshakela, and the Maimer from the Reb Marash, B'dibra Masel Kiboy Elayach Yisayach, Reish Tafresh Lamed Daled, which would be 1874. Okay. So this is a little more explanation. What I said, I was going to review this from the source, which is an Eira Teira, and also printed. There was a sefer called Derech Mitzasecha Ayin Beis. It was from the Tzemach Tzedek, but because of the printing rights and so on, they had to call it by a name of a book that was already printed, Derech Mitzasecha Ayin Beis. But it's really Pirush Hamilas. But it's a book that's out of print, And all the Maimorim there were reprinted in different places, primarily in Eira Teda, Maimor Azal, Vinyonim. But some of the Maimorim were printed in the books, like a Maimor and Yom Kippur would have been in Eira Teda, Yom Kippur, volume 5, that I referred to a few times. So I just wanted to read a section there that this is based on. It just, you'll see, first of all, the similarities, and it adds here and there an emphasis, but when you look at then, it gets clear the picture that I just reviewed. So I'm looking at this mimer is, like I said, the beer of Kibiyem Hazeh Yechaper Tovkuf Samach Beis, Alter Rebbe's mimer. This is with the Hagos, with the glosses and the notes of the Tzemach Tzedek. So the mimer seems the first mimer, the original mimer of that Shabbos Shuvah of that year, the Tovkuf Samach Beis, which would be, I mentioned, would be 1801, was said on Shabbos Shuvah, but it looks like either Yom Kippur or Mitzvah Yom Kippur, probably, not sure, it's not very clear. There was a beer on that mimer. So the beer is printed in the actual mimer is printed in the Kutatera, Pasha Achre. But there only brings the beginning of the topic that he refers to and actually quotes that mimer on page 1334. Yeah. And I think later again, he quotes it again on another page, I think on 37 rather. So on 1334, he quotes it. And then the beer is really the discussion of the whole Nikras Atzur, which there in the Kutatera, he talks about Sur, but only Sur as the source of all Havayas, all creation. So in the beer, as I said, is printed in Tovkuf Samach Beis of the Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe, and with the Tzemach Tzedek's notes in that Derech Mesecha volume 2, and then reprinted in Eira Teda, which I'm going to right now refer to on page 2021-31, and I posted the pages if you want to follow, but I'm going to do it pretty quickly. So let me just give you the picture here. So he says like this. Actually, that's not where I'm going to read from. The topic begins in chapter 3 in the Maimer, where he says, Lahavin zeh tzorech lahavin apsukim, aniskarim koidem inyan yud gimel midas harachmim. We have to first understand the verses that were said before the Yud Gimel Midas Harachmim, and there he goes into the Hine Mokim Iti and Nikras Atzur and all that we just discussed. And he brings different sources for it. And he says there on page 2131 that this is the level of Butzina D'Karidnusa, Gevuros of Atik, which is Malchus, and that is the level of Tzur, and he explains the level of Tzur from different sources. What I want to read is on page, few pages later, where he goes back to the topic. So he says like this. At the bottom of page 2133, he says like this. He says, I will place you in the crevice, in the cavity of the rock. And from there come and Hashem showed him exactly the words in Ayin Beis are word for word from here. He showed it to them, to Moshe rather, by hiding his neshama in the cavity of the rock. Like he said here, concealed from revelation. It's a concealed state. And now he goes in the parentheses, he brings Nikras, who Kamashikosa be Yeshaya, Seif Simon Beis, Love Benikras Atsurim, and Opirish Amitsudas Sian, Inyan Chur Venekov, Kamoy, the El, Bukeva's Ber Nikartam. That's Chur Venekov, the whole, is like it says in Yeshaya, Nun Aleph, 51, that he brings in Ayin Beis. The Koyal Soda, that goes on Soda, from there is the womb, and that's the rechem, that's the womb from where the birthing comes. So it's a cavity, a concealed state from where the birthing comes. The imke needed the hainu yesei the nukve. So from that appears that this is the level of yesei the nukve. Here he says nira. That's Rebbe Rashab takes out the word nira. He just says hainu b'chayz yesod the nukva, the yesod of Malchus. Okay. Then he continues. V'chein ulefi masher kosav b'pardas the sur hu Binah im kein nikras atzur han yesod the ima. The second interpretation, it's yesod of Binah. V'chein lefi masher kosav here. What we're learning here, the suru Gevuros of Atik shayach gamken b'china zu ki pirish Butzina D'Karidnusa gamken yesod the nukva shenikrat sur. And he quotes here Moshe kosav b'zeir arikia, like the Rebbe Rashab quotes Bereshis Davtas Vov. So here we have the three interpretations as we just learned them, but also the reconciliation as he continues. V'im kein b'china zu al derech aliyah zah b'chinas ibur b'yesod the ima. So then this level is, according to the Pardes, it's the aliyah of Zah to the Ibur, the second Ibur Sheni, in Yesod, in the cavity, and Bitl within Binah. So Tzemach Tzedek actually adds citations that the Rebbe Rashab did not quote that explains this further. And then he continues, and here is now this is the source for the Rebbe Rashab does quote, that Yesod Binah, or Yesod Nukva rather, is the iskashrus to contain, to absorb and receive the flow, like an empty container that grasps and contains. And this is called Keishal Bracha, the container, the kos, the cup of blessing, because it receives bracha. And here he says, the same Maimon the Rebbe Rashab does quote this. Here's the additional point that adds understanding. And this is that I will place you in the cavity within the rock. That Moshe would be encompassed within the bitl of the chesem shekeya, the inverted seal. Remember, we spoke about a protruded seal, and an inverted one is more like a keli, like when you engrave something, so it's inverted. The eskleireka marzika er hagolish mepchinas baver kvedi. That Moshe would be like a clay rekon, like the crevice in the rock. He would be in that type of state, like a child within the womb, to receive the gilui of the 13 attributes as baver kvedi, when my Kovod, when my 13 attributes will pass by. That's the Tzemach Tzedek, the basis of what the Rebbe Rashab said. So there's some extra words here that help us understand the meaning behind it all. So that's where I'm going to stop here in the Tzemach Tzedek and go back to Ayin Beis. But I'll stop now if anybody wants to ask anything, because I'm ready to move on to the next paragraph.
Interesting, he said when the Malachim came to Avram, they sent a koish shel bracha l'shager lo koish shel bracha, to sorrow. So that's the inyan here. The beetle that is mekabel from the higher level.
Okay, good.
I have a question. We understand that the Yud Gimel Midas Arachamim are coming from the highest place of this Gevuros of Atik, and essentially we're talking about this tzur, but it sounds like even more specifically it's this crevice within the tzur. Is that a more correct, a more specific statement?
The verse says that he stood on the rock, and then God made a crevice in the rock where he placed him as the Kovod passed by. So we explained that the rock is the source, is Butzina D'Karidnusa. The crevice is the bitl within it, the yesod within it. So, what? Is that what you're asking?
I guess you're saying it's in order to connect with the Yud Gimel Midas Rachamim, you basically need to understand both of those components, because the Yesod is the connect, the crevice that is the Yesod is the connecting element. So you can't just say it's the rock, and you can't just say it's the crevice. It's both. Is that what you're trying to say?
The crevice indicates a state of a womb-like state of a bitl, of a clay raycon. When you just have a rock indicates the very source of all existence, like the Reshimu. But there's also, remember, a chol and pane there. There's a space. So there's two aspects going on. There's the actual source of everything that will come. The tzur is like the rock, like you said, the Butzina D'Karidnusa, the hard or dark flame, which is the root of kol havayas, like a flintstone where all the sparks come. And Moshe, being able to receive from there, is his bittul, as he's in that crevice, in the cavity within the rock, is essentially what he's saying.
Okay.
But isn't the hashpah of the Yud Gimel Midas Rachamim coming from the Kovod of a Kodesh Baruch Hu that passes over the tzur and the nikras, the crevice?
Yeah, but how does Moshe receive it? He says, how does he show him this Kovod and this Yud Gimel Rachamim al yeshihit min nishmosei b'nikras hatzur? So yes, it's not. So yes, exactly.
So it's not the source of Yud Gimel Rachamim, the tzur. It's the Kovod that's coming, isn't it? It's the Kovod that's coming, passing over the tzur, that's bringing it.
The tzur is, one second, hold on. The Reshimu or the Butzina D'Karidnusa are all divine creations. They're all divine dimensions. So when you say that the 13 attributes are coming from the tzur, he says that explicitly, that the tzur is Butzina. From there come the 13. Kovod is coming from the tzur. God's deep, powerful revelation of Yud Gimel Rachamim is coming from Gevuros of Atik, or what he calls here Butzina D'Karidnusa, the Gevura. So that is the Kovod is, and the tzur are connected in that sense. And then Moshe is receiving it. The tzur is a divine dimension. We're going to learn about the Kovod shortly. He's going to talk about the Kovod now in more detail. You'll see how that works into this. But first, the first thing is that Hashem says, Hine mokim iti. Space is with me. The space is with me. And he referred that the space is the Reshimu, the empty space, which is the Reshimu. Then he explained that tzur is that level as well. He says, V'nitzavta tzur, and it will stand on the rock. And then he continues, and I will place you in a crevice within the rock as my Kovod passes. We're now going to learn what that Kovod is in the next paragraph. So you'll see more details. But essentially, these are, yes.
So you have here the tzur and the nikras hatzur. The kvodi is the tzur, which means...
We'll see now when he talks about the kvodi, he's going to explain kvodi in the next paragraph. Let's not speculate. He's going to explain it. It's part of the mimer. And it's also the mimer of the Tzemach Tzedek. He talks about it. Yeah. We're going to learn about it right now.
Few days ago, you said
the whole section now.
That in Reshimu there are two parts. Few days ago, you said.
Why are we guessing? Let's just learn it inside, and then we'll see if it's clear or not. So let's not talk about the Kovod right now. Let's talk about what I just discussed. Any more questions on what I learned? The Kovod we're going to learn about now, the next paragraph. Okay, so let's continue.
It's not only the Reshimu, it's the same thing parallel, much higher, the Helemo Atzmi, right?
He doesn't mention that here, so I'm not going to mention that here. We already talked earlier that the Reshimu was rooted in the Helema Atzmi. Here he's not referring to that right now. But he did say it earlier, yeah. The last line, that, by the way, the Eira, I will say, V'hainu b'chinas Gevuros Atik Gemin, v'yidezer roh sheirish hayud gimel midas. So when Moshe was placed in this crevice, in this cavity, he saw the root of the Yud Gimel Midas, V'hainu v'yikra Hashem al ponav el kel racham. Okay. Yeah, Gevuros Atik Gemin, and through that he saw. So Moshe was placed in that spot, and he was able to see it. Good. So this explains the significance of this cryptic. What's the rock? What's the crevice within the rock? What's going on here? Now we understand what level that is. That's the key thing to keep in mind. And that's the Gevuros of Atik, Butzina D'Karidnusa, the Reshimu, from which everything arrives from.
Where would you
There's more to say on this, but I'd rather, this is what we know from the Rebbe Rashab. You can start Parkinzech and also say the Reshimu, how we know, has two components. Etzem Nekudas Reshimu, and there's the oil within the Reshimu. That's the concealed oil. But he's not going into that right now. So let's just continue. We're going to learn here. Someone wants to ask something? Go ahead.
Yeah, he said here, where you do what you say, Kashus, the Kabel, the liquid, it's a shefa. So that means this is a clear record maxik. This is something that is waiting. The Kabel, the liquid, as a shefa, something which is higher.
This is what I explained. That Moshe is like in a womb-like state. He's in a state of klei reikon. I read from the Tzemach Tzedek exactly those words. He said, Samticha v'samticha b'nikras hatzur sheyuchlo b'chinas bittul d'chesim shekeya lias klei reika machzikair hagole shemibchinas ba'avur kvedi. Exactly. That's what allows Moshe the bittul to receive. That's what that state is. It's a state of bittul to receive that gilui. And lamata and aveda is the bittul of the nefesh habamis, as explained below. Kedei lekabel b'chinas sur. Okay. Ready to continue? V'omnom, now says the Rebbe Rashab continues. V'omnom, and I'm going to compare it where necessary to the Tzemach Tzedek's Maimer, because he speaks about it as well throughout. So he says omnom. Now, however, omnom usually is like a qualification. So we'll see what that means shortly. When my kovod will pass, that's the next part of the pasuk. If you go back to the bottom of page 1333, he read it all. He said, so if you go back there, he actually quoted from the Zohar, if you remember, yes, a dark place, a very concealed place. Now he's going to explain what is the Baver Kvedi. What does it mean that my kovod will pass and I'll place you in the Nikras Hatzur? Rashi says to protect him, because the gili was so strong. To protect him, he placed him inside the so-called crevice. So he's like, what do you do when a very strong power is coming by? Let's say for argument's sake, just a simple example. Let's say there's an avalanche or there's water rushing down. You hide inside a crevice, inside the rock, so it doesn't hurt you. So here, as the kovod will pass by, you'll be inside the rock, so you'll be able to see it. And then he goes on to say, you'll see my back and not my face. My face you won't see. So he's not going to explain what is this. What?
I will put my cup on you.
My cup, my hand over you to protect you, yeah. But two things, but he'll place them inside the crevice. So he's now going to explain what is Baver Kvedi v'Samticha. What is the level of kovod? When we say Kvedi, my honor, my glory, what does that mean? Ki yadua in a kovod hu b'chinas Malchus. Kovod is the level of Malchus. So that's what we say, Kved Malchuse. Malchus, Kved Malchus, Kved Malchuse. Glory, honor is connected to Malchus, to kingship. So we see that Kovod and Malchus connected, the idea of honoring a king, and a king is evokes honor. The Ikrin HaMelucha hu Kovod HaMelech, or Kved HaMelech. The primary idea of Melucha, of kingship, is honoring the king. There are many things about a king, but what makes him a king? What's the primary thing that defines him as a king? That he deserves a certain specific honor. He deserves honor. Like you just said. That will declare the glory of his Malchus, the honor of his Malchus. it's so much connected to Malchus that even if a melech forgoes and forgives and says, I don't mind if you don't honor me, he doesn't have that power, because Malchus and Kovod are synonymous. They're dependent on each other. So when it comes to a chacham, it says Talmud chacham shemachal al kveidei. So the Gemara says in Kedushin, so he has a right because Torah dilehu. Once he learned Torah, even though it's Hashem's Torah, so you could say he also can't forgive Hashem's Torah, but because it became internalized, he has the power to say, I forgo my honor. Not getting into the discussion why and so on, but Kovod Malchus, it's not your honor. It's the Malchus is connected to Kovod, so a melech cannot forgo it. Malchus and Kovod are in. If you take away Kovod, there's no Malchus. So ein kvei mochel. Because Kovod and honor, glory is from Ikr. Before he said it's the Ikrinyan. Now he says from Ikre and Yone, from the primary ingredients or the primary components and elements of Melucha, of kingship, is Kovod. So we know now that Kovod, when we say Kovod, is Malchus. The Nimtza, Kovod she'esalei ha'eved, a Kovod that the servant of the king does to him. When a servant honors the king, and he fulfills his desire. So the king tells him, I want you, commands him to do something. So you see the Eved is honoring him and fulfilling and realizing and actualizing whatever he wants. He follows his command. Who gave him Teisvus Chayis B'Leiv HaMelech. That causes a increase of vitality in the heart of the king. When a king sees that subjugation and that respect and that honor, and we're talking a healthy one. He's not talking here a cruel king or who's abusive king. He's talking here a humble king. So that adds Teisvus Chayis B'Leiv HaMelech. And it increases his energy, increases vitality, increases his nachas, his joy. He says Chayis B'Leiv HaMelech. And the opposite. Why? Because since Kovod and Malchus are so connected, it's not two separate things. Even though every human being, when you ask someone to do something for you, not a king, and they do it, that also gives you satisfaction. That's the word I was looking for, satisfaction. But by a king, since Kovod is so much part of the king, so it's negeya. That's why when he's shown Kovod, it increases his satisfaction. And the same is the opposite. Ubehepach. Heder HaKovod, vehepach harotzen. Ubehepach heder HaKovod. And the opposite. When there's a lack of respect and honor, vehepach harotzen, and a lack of fulfilling and not listening to what he wants, geirim geroyin chayes halev, belev, that causes a diminishment, a certain despondency, the opposite of satisfaction, a certain sadness, he calls it geroyin chayes belev, a certain down crest or down, what's the word I want to use? Downfallen attitude. To the point that he can get angry. He gets angry, and his heart becomes harsh. So we see how Kovod is inextricably bound with Malchus. Just want to see how the Tzemach Tzedek puts it, or the Maim of the Alter Rebbe. Exactly the same lashon. It's exactly the same language from the Tzemach Tzedek that I was reading. So now this is all a mashal. This is how we understand it below in a king and a servant. So understand what Kovod is. Now, what is it l'mayla? When we talk about kvei what the Kovod of the Eibishter, what are we referring to when we say Kovod? His Kovod. So he says, Kain al derech mashal. So too for example, this is an example. Hazochi is shomaisa tachtenim. That the good deeds, the merits, that when we behave the way God asked us to behave, in other words, we fulfill His rotzen, we honor Him, and we fulfill what He asked us to do. Maisa tachtenim mean the actions down below. Geirmim teisvus eir b'midas u'malchus da'atzilus. that generates an additional energies in the Midas and Malchus of Atzilus. Not just Malchus, it says the Midas of Atzilus. Remember, Belev HaMelech. Because the king, just like a king gets encouraged, spirits go up. He gets satisfied through that honoring him. Same thing, Lamata, when Ma'aseh Tartein, the Zochis, our good deeds, so to speak, strengthen the Midas and Malchus of Atzilus. U'kamoisha Kosav, va'ata yigdalna koyach adnai. It's in Parsha Shlach. Va'ata yigdalna koyach adnai. That you have the power to strengthen koyach adnai, the power of God. Now, of course, the question is, does God need us to get stronger? So clearly he's talking here in Ishtalshlus now, he's talking the Midas and Malchus of Atzilus. Shemesifim koyach begvura shel maila. That our deeds, our good deeds, increase in the divine energy above. That's the language of Chazal on this pasuk. So we have the power, so to speak, like we say when we bring a korban. Reach nechayich laHashem. So what does it say? Nachas ruach lefanesh shemati v'naseh etzeni. You create nachas ruach by the Eibishter when you fulfill His will. So it's not just for us; it's also for higher levels. That you reveal deeper levels of godliness in Atzilus, is what he's saying right now. Ulahepech, and just like it is with a servant in the example, the opposite is also true. When he doesn't honor and doesn't fulfill with the king, sins weaken the divine power and actually cause a diminishment in it. Again, we're not talking about an atzmus, we're not talking about in the highest levels where God is beyond. We're talking about where God chose to relate with us and says, you control somewhat, kavyochel, my destiny as well. Your good deeds increase my kingship, and your negative deeds weaken it. That's why you see that when the Jewish people are kablu malchusei, and they receive, like we say Rosh Hashanah, we're machtir, tamlichuni aleichem, we crown God as king, we honor him as our king, that elevates Malchus, and that draws Malchus down. When God forbid we deny, we're defiant, and we reject or dishonor God and don't accept him as king, we don't honor him and don't live up to his ratzon, so in a sense we weaken the connection of Malchus to existence. Okay, so that's what he said so far about Kovod and so on. It says, Omnom, however, we need to qualify this. 1 second. This, however, is not a true diminishment, God forbid. Like, for example, hakas, we mentioned before that the king gets upset, gets angry. Where does anger come from? From the gevuros within the blood. The blood begins to rush. When a person gets angry, you see their face gets red. Their blood pressure goes up, basically. And the more energy, or the more the blood pressure goes up in the bedomim, in the blood, the more the blood begins to boil in the person, his kas will be greater when he doesn't achieve his desire. So when a person is asking for something, in this case, talking about the melech, and he's not getting what he wants, masik means to get, to reach, cheftzeit, his desire, to fulfill his desire. So we see as the blood rushes, the gevuros go up, the anger gets greater. Because anger comes from the fiery, from the bubbling blood. As the blood is warm and hot-blooded, so when it gets boiled up, so to speak, that's where anger comes from. The blood, the gevuros are bubbling up and they're becoming stronger, like a strong fire, fiery. And that's anger, comes from a fiery attitude. And whereas in the elements, on the elementary level, it comes from the you say the archetype, the foundation of fire. There's Eish, Ruach, Mayim, Ofar. So Eish Shabbalah, the Yesod, there's no actual fire, but it comes from a fiery personality in the heart. When a heart starts beating, when a person is very passionate. So there are all kinds of expressions, but Kas is one of them. The truth is, in Tanya, he also says at the end of chapter 1 that Eish is the root of Kas and Gaiva. Kas is very clear because it's fiery, a fiery anger. We say fiery rage. Okay, actually brings like he says in Tanya, first part, end of chapter 1. V'sham Kosav in Tanya, he writes, he adds a different element there. It doesn't just focus on the fire as in the heat of the moment, but there, because fire rises, because fire rises upward, same thing with anger and gaiva as well. He's just qualifying because in Tanya, the focus is not so much on the heat part, the blood as in the anger that comes from a high blood pressure, so to speak, where the blood begins to rush and gets more bubbly, more fiery. There he refers to also the Eish as it going. So he says that's explained elsewhere. Clearly not relevant to us. He just wants to be thorough. So if you look in Tanya, you see the focus is on Nigba Lamayla, the flames going upward. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
What else are we saying?
Yeah.
And wherever there's more blood, meaning a more rush of blood, to the ticha, the boiling part of it, the ticha is like boiling, something boils, the more boiling the anger will be. V'zeu, in the parentheses he adds now, v'zeu the bezin yonim shebegvura hein haba hatalia canal. He's now taking this back. If you remember in the beginning when he started speaking about Gvura on page 1334, he said there's two opposite interpretations. Tzimtzum and Helim, concealment and diminishment, and then intensity and power and force. And he said, Haba Hatalia. Them is their independence. And now he's going to explain, even though we already understood some explanation before, but he's going to say it now specifically, explicitly. And this is the two in Yonim Shebegvura, Hein Haba Hatalia canal. On page 1334, that the two elements in Gvura, its diminishment and its intensity are interdependent. Why? The B'chinas Gvuras v'dinim hu meb'chinas tagberes hachayis. When there's an intensity of the fiery, and intensity of the power of Gvura, what does it result in? Gvuras and dinim, judgments and severities. You become angry. So even though till now we've been learning that the intensity of Gvura brings to Yud Gimel Midas HaRachamim, and brings to all the amshachas that come down below, we're going to learn about that's the tshuva part, that's the transformation. But you could also say when there's more intensity in a person is more fired up, it'll also be much more judgmental. So that's another side to Gvura. So Gvura can go in both directions. The intensity can lead to actually more compassion and transforming Gvura to Sdeinis to Zachis, but it could also lead to more Gvuras v'dinin, in this case, like we see, where there's more passion, there's more anger. Okay, he's saying specifically, and Gvuras are sweetened dafke b'sharsha. In other words, the Gvuras themselves can be very severe. And how are they sweetened? By the very severity that was their root, which was the intensity. So it came down now in a negative way, in harsh severities, anger, because of sins. But that very source, that intensity, also can create transforming the Gvura in their root, that it transforms it to the Yud Gimel Midas HaRachamim, which is the sweetening from within the Gvura. So you have all the interpretations here in one place. Basically, briefly stated, the Gvuras we see in this world, the harshest ones, the darkest moments, what we talked about, the harsh severities, like we spoke, Gvuras Koshes and so on. But even things like the Holocaust and the darkest moments. So though they are terrible, but how are they possible to manifest even? Is because they're rooted in the Helam Ha'atzmi and God's power to conceal. The intention of the power to conceal was not that it should come down into tragic situation. It should be such intensity that we reveal it ultimately. But it has the potential to end up in a very harsh place. Now, how do you transform that? So you can transform it by bringing chesed and sweetening it from without, not within, or through the tshuva that we spoke about, where the despair, the very hitting rock bottom, that darkness has in it the power of the source. And that also has an intensity that can be directed towards something. Like we said, when a person is in the darkest place, they're also the intensity of their tzemoyin, of their thirst. Like he explains earlier and explains in the end of chapter 7 in chapter 7 in Tanya. Their thirst is also extremely intense. And that came from darkness. Where did that intensity come? Because in the root, the intensity was a healthy intensity. Unfortunately, it was like any fire. A fire can destroy. A fire also can bring things. We need warmth and we need fire to live. So the transformation also comes from the intensity, but so does the negative. That's briefly what he's saying here. We're going to talk about this more, but that's what he's saying in the parentheses. So now you see all the Gevuros coming together, all the different meanings. Okay. And he brings what he said earlier, like an animal. We spoke the difference between animals, wild animals, aggressive animals, predators, in contrast to cattle. So we see that the kas, the anger, and the ritziche, the aggression, the violence, even the murderous violence of an animal that's provoked, or an animal that is that is hunting and hungry, harba min ha-behema. Yesha harba min ha-behema. It's much more than a behema. Behema can get upset as well, but you don't see it quite with the same intensity. V'zeu mitzad ribei hachayis shebakanal. That's due to the ribei hachayis. So the ribei hachayis can go into the terrible place, like we see. A person who has a lot of fiery passion can be very, very angry, or they can be very, very forgiving, which is the other side when it's transformed, as we shall learn. And then he's going to continue and explain these two parts. Because of time limits, I have to stop here. Because I have to move on right now. I have something I must do. But the next few lines he's going to explain that this is where Kovod comes into play. That when the Kovod is honored, it adds, and the person will have more rachmanis. When the Kovod is denied or hurt or dishonored, that's what causes the fiery passion going the other direction. He's going to discuss it more in detail afterwards. So I'm going to stop here, and maybe I'll take a question or two. But I have to stop here. So, anyone want to ask anything? It's not finished because he still has to finish the subject matter. So the next part of the paragraph he's going to finish it. We'll do that on Sunday. Because he still has to explain why it's not a geroyin amiti, why it's not a true diminishment. It's only a diminishment on the outer level. But we'll get back to that, as I said. Okay. No one's asking anything? Fine. So I'm stopping here 2/3 of the way down on page 13.